সবাইকে আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি নন্দন নির্বাচনী সংলাপে। আপনারা জানেন এই অনুষ্ঠানে আমরা আসন্ন কানাডার জাতীয় নির্বাচন নিয়ে নানা রকম কথা বলছি, বিশ্লেষণ করছি এবং কথা বলছি বিভিন্ন প্রার্থীদের সাথে। আজ আমাদের স্টুডিওতে উপস্থিত হয়েছেন লিবারেল দলের তৃতীয়বারের মতো মনোনয়ন প্রার্থী, যিনি দুবার খুব সফলভাবে তার দায়িত্ব পালন করেছেন একজন এমপি হিসেবে, বিচেস ইস্ট ইয়র্কের নাথানিয়েল এরিকসন স্মিথ। আপনারা সবাই তাকে চেনেন, জানেন এবং তাকে ভালোবাসেন। চলুন তার সঙ্গে আমরা আজ কথা বলি। ওয়েলকাম টু আওয়ার স্টুডিও। হাউ আর ইউ টুডে?
Good, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. As you know, I just described to our audience that we are talking about this upcoming election, which was quite surprising to the voters, and I think you guys also a bit not ready. But do you think that you are ready now?
So locally, we've certainly been ready. We have, I'm wearing my shorts and sneakers to knock on doors, and I've been knocking on doors ever since the start with a big team. We've made tens of thousands of phone calls since May, so we were ready. The national campaign, I think there were some challenges just with moving from governing, because there's still so much work to be done for moving from governing to campaigning. But I fully expect, as more Canadians pay attention post-Labor Day, that there will be a full court press to explain to Canadians what the plan is to finish the fight against COVID and to really build on the significant progress we've made over these last 6 years, with the pandemic thrown in for good measure. And in terms of the rationale for the election and the surprise, I would say I understand, especially in the course of the pandemic, people are so busy with their own lives and just trying to keep their heads above water. But for those of us in Parliament, I've done this for 6 years, not too long, but I can tell you, as someone who takes cooperation in Parliament seriously, and I do my best to work across party lines, the session from January to June was incredibly broken. I said in my first speech in the House after the 2019 election that minority parliaments hold the potential for greatness, and I still think that's true. I pointed to the Pearson years and the Cnada pension plan and public health care, and there was so much accomplished in that minority government. And there was great cooperation in this minority government to deliver benefits for individuals and businesses in this pandemic, and there was great cooperation, and then that cooperation stalled, and it was fleeting. And so from January to June, we saw gun control stall. We saw privacy protections for our kids online stall. We saw criminal justice reform stall. We barely got through net zero and UNDRIP legislation. And so from the government's perspective, and I have mixed feelings about the election myself, but from the government's perspective, it does make sense when they look at the agenda they want to pursue going forward, especially the recovery agenda, to make sure we're all looked after. And they see the dysfunction in Parliament, and they say, we can't have a dysfunctional Parliament. An election offers a reset. Obviously, the Liberal government wants a majority, but I would also say, even if it's a minority, an election offers a reset, and we can get back to work, and that's what I hope the voters do. I hope they send us back to work.
Oh, that sounds very enthusiastic. But some of the leaders, some of the party leaders and the parties, and the vast majority people are saying that September month is a very crucial month, as you know, that schools are opening. And the international students are coming up. So all these things, and internationally, Afghanistan issue is a big problem. So how you and your party are coping up and coherently going ahead for this election?
So I share the frustration with September in many respects. I have a 20-month-old who's just started childcare 2 days ago. I have a 5-year-old who is starting school next week, and all the stresses of that. He did virtual school last year, and he'll be in person this year, and that's stressful for my wife and I. And my wife actually, who I know many in the community know, but my wife is starting a PhD in nutritional sciences. And so it's a very busy September for my family too. Okay. And here I am out knocking on doors in the middle of an election. But I would also say Parliament usually has a summer recess. And so we rose at the end of June, and we sit again mid-September. So the reason for a very short election, and that's what this is, it's a very short election, but the reason for the election before the fall session was so that we could get back to work. The idea that we're not going to lose a lot of time, and we want to make sure that the coming session is as functional and effective as possible. Do I wish that the election happened in mid-August? Personally, yes, but I will live with mid-September.
I can imagine how you're going through, you and your family, all the very best. Basically, you were a vegan, right?
Yes, yeah.
And also, you are very vocal about the rights of animal rights and nature, and you probably introduced a bill which was, of course, to protect the animal rights. How is it going on?
So I introduced, this was early in 2016, so quite some time ago, a bill called the Modernizing Animal Protections Act. And I worked with animal welfare organizations, national associations across this country, including the Federation of Canadian Humane Societies, to put the bill together. And it was really focused on addressing animal abuse, and it was focused on prohibiting the shark fin trade, and it was really to modernize some areas of law because Canada lags the rest of the world in many respects. And we've seen progress. So the government, in response to my bill, passed a law in 2018, 2019 to take action and to better address animal abuse and animal fighting. They also passed legislation to prohibit the shark fin trade. And in this coming platform, if we're lucky to be reelected, there's action to further strengthen animal welfare, to build on a piece of legislation known as the Jane Goodall Act, to end the live export of horses for slaughter, and to really end cosmetic testing and phase out animal testing writ large in partnership with our American allies. What I would say on this issue in particular, as we live through a pandemic, people, I hope, will learn and appreciate the interconnectedness between animal health, human health, and environmental health. And when you speak to international experts, they talk about this one health, one welfare approach. But when we look at climate change as an example, if we lose forests and we lose biodiversity, animals interact with humans more, and then there's the risk of increased spillover of zoonotic diseases. And we are living through a pandemic because of a zoonotic disease, and we see that 75% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonoses. And so if we don't strengthen animal protections, if we don't strengthen environmental protections, we aren't looking after our own human health. And this isn't me saying this is the UN Environment Program, but this is experts around the world. So that's an area that we really have to focus on, this idea of preventing future pandemics.
Okay, talking about pandemics, that it's very sad, I would say, that Canada, being such a big country, was not able to produce their own vaccine.
Right.
And still we are depending on it. Do you think that the circumstances will be like this soon, that Canada can produce their own vaccine so that people will be very confident?
Unquestionably, yes. And this is an area where I hope Canadians in this course of this election reflect on how the federal government responded in this pandemic. And has the response been perfect? No. But have we shown competence in a crisis? The Prime Minister was out front of his home and what they call the cottage, Rideau Cottage, every day, assuring Canadians that we would have Canadians' backs. And the government did, whether it was vaccine procurement, so that there was enough vaccine in this country for every eligible Canadian by the end of July, as opposed to the long-stated end of September, or whether it was benefits for individuals and businesses that were a lifeline. What I would say about vaccine production capacity, we used to have it many years ago, and unfortunately, in the course of this pandemic, and since we've been in office, we've never had that capacity. And so, learning the lesson of this pandemic, the importance of domestic vaccine manufacturing capacity, we're lucky to have the vaccines that we do now, but February was a tough month, and it was a tough month because of that lack of capacity. So there has been a $3 billion overall investment in the last year and a half, and a partnership with Sanofi here in Toronto, a partnership with a Saskatchewan research facility. They make animal vaccines right now, and they're moving to human vaccines. Partnership with Moderna, but also the one that's going to be coming online very soon is a partnership with Novavax at the National Research Facility in Montreal. And whether it's the end of the year or early next year, we are going to be in a place where we don't only have our own domestic supply for boosters and the like, but we also are able to contribute meaningfully, even more than we already have, to global vaccine equity, which is critical. I mean, I've received correspondence and corresponded with the Bangladeshi High Commissioner, but there are many countries that are in desperate need. And really importantly, we've donated 30 million vaccine doses so far, but the platform commits us to contribute another 200 million doses. We are going to be not only playing a leading role securing our own supply, we're going to play a leading role securing the world's supply.
Hopefully, because Canada, everybody is not yet vaccinated, and some are in crisis, I heard. And if we think that we can have the ability to do by ourselves, that would be too good. And there are also some campaign and some protest going against the vaccine.
Yeah.
How would you think, what kind of mechanism can you use, or the government should use to motivate people? Because this is such a sensitive matter. You know, in Canada, you cannot say that you have to take the vaccine or something like that, but for the betterment and for our next future generation, it's very important. So what is the mechanism? You tell me.
Well, it's a frustrating situation because we see people around the world. People around the world are desperate for vaccine doses, and here in Canada, you have individuals protesting against sensible vaccine rules, and it's frustrating. And
not only in Canada, actually in
elsewhere too, in the U.S. and in France, we see some of it, and it's incredibly frustrating. And I think much comes down to misinformation and disinformation that people have read online, and it's unfortunate. And so the Prime Minister rightly said, we have to meet these protesters with compassion, and I also wrote separately to say, yes, with compassion, but also firmly with the facts that these vaccines are safe, they are effective. The overwhelming consensus of the scientific community is that they are necessary to get us through this pandemic. They are one of the most important public health responses to this pandemic, and we know that there's so much work that goes into making sure that they are safe and that they're effective. And you see health regulators not only in Canada but around the world that have worked very quickly with additional resources to make sure that they can ensure just that. And so we've worked as a local office. We've worked very closely with local health partners, whether it's Dentonia Park or down on the beaches or otherwise in Crescenttown, to make sure we help spread the word and increase awareness, and especially in those moments of pop-up clinics when we didn't have the supply that we currently do, where everyone was desperate to get it, we were helping to facilitate that. Now it's a little bit different, right? We have an overwhelming amount of supply. Supply is not the challenge. The challenge is making sure that we are encouraging people to get it. And education is one big part of it. It continues to be. But we also know, for anyone with kids, that there's been a long-standing rule that I just sent my kid to childcare 2 days ago, and we had to provide an updated immunization record. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to take that same philosophy to say, to keep us all safe, we have to update our immunization records and make sure we are up to date with our own immunizations. It's not only for our own safety, it's for the safety of our community. And we need to require that same kind of approach in high-risk settings. So we see the federal government come forward and say there will be sensible mandatory rules for trains and for planes and for interprovincial travel. We already have a clear delineation. We can't stop, obviously, people from coming into our country who are Canadian, but if you are unvaccinated, there will be different rules. You'll have to quarantine in a way that you don't have to quarantine if you're fully vaccinated. You'll be subject to multiple tests in a way that you won't have to be if you're fully vaccinated. And we've also suggested and proposed sensible vaccine rules for the civil service, especially for those who are in a public-facing element. And so that will all come at the provincial level, and then or at the federal level, and then at the provincial level, we've said it's provincial jurisdiction, they have the health data, but we are going to support sensible vaccine credentials. And so whether it is going to the baseball game, or whether it is going to live music events, again, or bars or restaurants, higher risk congregate settings, making sure that there are sensible rules, again, to make sure that people feel safe. And it's not only a matter of our safety as far as our health, it's also a matter of the health of our economy, because our economy is built on trust. And if people don't trust that they're going to be safe going out and about and engaging in our economy will function less effectively. So really we've learned in this pandemic, you can't pull apart health and economic concerns. They really are tied together.
You just said that there must be a mismessaging going to this protester. Do you think that the real information and the message from the health authority or the government is not reaching them properly?
I'm not sure, because I think different people have different responses. I think there are some people who, I've knocked on doors, there are some people who legitimately express vaccine hesitancy, and that can be overcome with credible information, with education, and with compassion. There are, obviously, when you look at those protests, that is not a question of vaccine hesitancy. They are spreading misinformation, and they are
deliberate
and deliberately trading on misinformation, and there's no easy answer to that, right? So we just have to meet it firmly with the facts and try to listen as best we can and push back with science and with evidence. And not everyone, it won't get to everyone, right? So it's the same we look at, and there's an interesting crossover between the anti-vax protests that we see and the far-right sort of extremist xenophobic elements. And you almost have to reach people when they're younger to teach them to love and not hate, right? Because at some point, if you're speaking to a 50-year-old white man who's at a protest railing against Muslims, I mean, you're not going to be able to reach that person, and that's why we have the criminal law, and that's why we have other responses. So it's a difficult response when you get to people who are so down the rabbit hole of wrong information, to bring them back up and to support them. It's incredibly hard to do.
So you obviously a very popular person. Not only you look good, you talk good, and I saw you were wearing Punjabis and our ataris, and you look good. And you are very, very on with the community. I was watching a debate. It's not a debate. You are doing online conversation with the voters. Everybody was saying, we love you, we vote you. But one person, there was a question came that, why would I vote you?
Yeah.
If I say, why would I vote you, what do you say?
Well, what I said last night, and by the way, in the course of this pandemic, we haven't been able to be out in the community as much, so we made a special effort to be available online and to do Facebook Q&As regularly and to answer people's questions, and it's been a great way to stay connected, although I'm very much looking forward to getting back out and being with the community. The Punjabis that I wear, I have a great collection because they're gifts from friends and community members, and I miss being out in the community. In terms of why to vote for me again and to vote for us again, I would say collectively, for me personally, I worked really hard in the last 6 years to deliver smart, fair, and honest government and representation here in Beaches East York. I overall support the Liberal government's objectives, but I will tell you, sometimes promises are broken, and then it's my job to push back and to hold the government accountable. It's my job to listen to the voices of our community and to push issues on the agenda. We talked about animal protections, but I can tell you the Canada Workers Benefit has gone from $1.2 billion to $3.8 billion, largely because of my advocacy, and that's a basic income benefit for the working poor. I've put issues on the agenda around immigration and refugees. I've put issues on the agenda around climate action and getting us to net zero. I put issues on the agenda around affordability. We see housing, and I got a number of questions yesterday around housing and housing affordability, and obviously childcare affordability is incredibly important too, and that's a big part of our platform. But on housing affordability, I brought caucus colleagues together in advance of the election to discuss housing issues and to make sure housing issues were a priority. So inside and outside of caucus, in the media and in the House of Commons, I hope that people see I've been a strong voice on behalf of our community, and if I'm re-elected, certainly I will continue to be that voice. And I am one of many Toronto MPs, and we've delivered for the City of Toronto, so billions in public transit. We've spent more on public transit than any government in Canadian history at the federal level. There are more electric buses in Toronto because of the federal government than any other city in North America. We've delivered for affordable housing, and that work will continue. We've delivered billions for childcare across the country, and then people need to know this because it's so important, and I'm especially sensitive to this because I've got young kids. But the cost of childcare is so high, and the childcare plan we put on the table, not just in this platform, but in the recent budget, estimates are it would save a Toronto family with an infant in licensed care $11,000 a year by 2022. So it'll save you more by 2026, but it'll save you $11,000 a year by 2022. So if you care about affordability in our city, if you care about climate action and protecting our planet, and you have an international concern, then not I'm there, but our government's there. I mean, we have made such meaningful progress. And let's keep in mind, because even when people point and say, well, what about this promise and what about that promise? There's promises delivered. There are promises that are well underway to being delivered, but it's only been 6 years, and of those 6 years, we've had a pandemic for almost 2 of them. And I'll close simply by saying, in terms of support for our government, I have had my share of disagreements with the Prime Minister and our government over these last 6 years. I always respectfully and always focused on ideas, but our government has shown competence in the greatest crisis of our lifetime.
Of course, and we all appreciate that.
I have family in Michigan, I have family in the UK, and I will tell you, I feel especially lucky to live in Canada, and I feel especially lucky because of the leadership of the Prime Minister and our federal government.
Exactly. But few minutes ago, you were talking about the Islamophobia and non-coherent relationship atmosphere sometimes occurs. And very recently we saw something happen in the Jame Mosque or something, and so and so. So what is your utmost efforts to mitigate and bring the coherent relationship with the community which you are working for?
On the question of greater tolerance and combating hate and discrimination, it's been an ongoing effort ever since I was first elected. When I think of, and people remember the Harper government imposed rules, anti-terror legislation, but who did it target? It targeted Muslims, and it was called C-51. And I had a civil liberties background, and so when I got to Ottawa, I very much focused on reforming those rules and making sure that they were fair and making sure that they didn't target one particular community as far as it goes. And we've seen similar, unfortunately, conservative rhetoric in the past around hotlines for barbaric cultural practices and the like. And so really push back against that kind of rhetoric. And unfortunately, around, it must have been in 2017, I think it was, around there, my colleague Ikra Khalid introduced a motion, the most innocuous motion in many respects. It sought to condemn Islamophobia. And I seconded that motion and supported Ikra. And I, being a white man, have not been privy to that kind of hate before, but to see what Ikra went through as someone who introduced a motion to condemn Islamophobia and the vitriol, the Islamophobia that was directed at her, it was hard to witness, and as someone close. And I had her at a town hall, and we even had people show up at our town hall locally that were screaming at her. It was unbelievable. And so unquestionably it's an issue we need to confront. How do we confront it? Well, we confront it by, one, as leaders, pushing other leaders to do better. And so when the Conservatives refused to vote in support of condemning Ikra's motion, I think thankfully the debate has now shifted, and now they're willing to condemn Islamophobia as the first step, at least, the most modest of all steps. And we as a government have obviously gone well beyond that. I mean, we have a national anti-racism strategy. We've proposed rules around, they're not in effect yet. That's one of the pieces of our platform, but certainly work has been underway to reform online hate rules and to better address the platforms and hold platforms accountable who allow this kind of vitriol and hate to be spread. And we also, there's a local paper in Beaches East York, Your Ward News, that we work to have Canada Post shut down. And lastly, and I mentioned the importance of getting to kids. And there's been a huge effort through Heritage Canada to address racism through funding, but funding for local organizations community organizations on the ground. We have organizations here in Beaches East York in the Bangladeshi community that are doing this work. They've received funding from Heritage Canada to specifically address Islamophobia. So I don't suggest all the work is done, and I recently met with the National Council of Canadian Muslims. They have a list of 61 recommendations. Some of those recommendations are certainly in the platform, and that's really important. Not all, though. And so my commitment is to work with the NCCM and continue this kind of work going forward. But in the end, I mean, I am not an overly religious person, but I deeply believe in religious equality and basic equality of concern and respect.
Recently, it come to our knowledge, I saw in the news that probably in Scarborough Southeast, Southwest, where Mr. Bill Blair's campaign was going on, and his campaign materials and everything was thrown out, and it was quite impossible in this country. So do you think that Election Commission look into all these kinds of matter and they're aware of it?
I'm not sure. I mean, we have seen defacement of signs in elections for as long as I've been involved in politics, and in the course of this election we've not only seen the incident with Bill, but we also saw colleagues of mine in Montreal where someone was drawing swastikas on their signs. And so it's not a new thing, and you try to address it. There is a police response if there's evidence to pursue, but it's not. I don't think it's an easy thing for the Elections Commissioner to pursue in quite the same way, unless it truly is a coordinated kind of attack, and in which case the Elections Commissioner presumably would work with law enforcement authorities. But for the single one-off instances of destruction of signs and defacement of signs, it's horrible. You move on. You take the high road, and you keep focusing on.
So
on
it
what
may
matters.
happen.
Yeah, it happens, yeah.
It shouldn't happen.
It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen, yeah.
If I say that the new commitment are coming up from every party, and the government party is emphasizing in a promise that everybody will get affordable house. I know you talked a lot about yesterday, but some are complaining that it is not affordable, it is very ambitious, expensive, rich richer, poor poorer. Say a few words about this.
Housing is the greatest challenge because not all tools to address housing are at the federal level. So it's incredibly frustrating, and I share it. I rent here in the city of Toronto, and we see house prices go up, and what happens? Well, rents go up too, because rents aren't perfectly aligned with home prices, but they increasingly are aligned. And so it's incredibly frustrating. People spend too much of their income on rent, and the idea of buying a home, an idea that used to be a regular commonplace idea. I can buy a home in my community. It, on average, if you think 40 years ago, it took 5 years on average to save up a down payment. In Toronto now, on average, it takes over 20 years to save a down payment. That simply isn't realistic for first-time home buyers and those who want to get into the market. And so we need to address it. It's not easy to address at the federal level. Not all tools are at our disposal, but there are a number of things we can do. And in this platform, we've proposed things in federal jurisdiction, but we've also proposed pushing provinces and cities to do more at the same time using federal power. And so on the federal side, we've proposed tamping down on demand by virtue of if someone wants to buy a second, third, fourth property, possibly having more stringent down payment rules and stress tests. We've focused on building more supply, putting much more money on the table. We've done a very good job at building affordable housing for very low income since 2015. We've tripled funding to end homelessness. We have a rapid housing initiative to end homelessness. But I don't think we've done a great job since 2015 for the middle class and affordable home ownership for the middle class. And so we've committed 1.4 billion homes being built or repaired over the next 4 years. It's a bolder commitment, and not my words, the Toronto Star's words, but a bolder commitment than the alternative parties. And we know we have to have more supply in our system to meet the growing demand. We've also, though, said we're going to use the federal spending power to push provinces and to push cities. Because when we look at municipalities, sometimes there's NIMBYism. Yes, we all agree there needs to be more affordable housing, but not in my backyard. And so we are really pushing, there's a $4 billion accelerator fund effectively to say, cities, if you want our money, you've got to get red tape out of the way, you've got to have inclusive zoning to have more affordability, and you've got to push back against that kind of NIMBYism. And we've also pushed into provincial jurisdiction to protect tenants' rights, because we know rent evictions and tenants don't have the same stability that owners have, so protecting tenants' rights, and then a home buyer's bill of rights, ensuring greater transparency in the process. So I don't propose we're going to fix affordability tomorrow. This is going to be a lot of work across all levels of government, but for the first time since I've been in Ottawa, as someone who is younger and has pushed on affordability concerns specifically around housing and generational fairness concerns specifically around housing, finally all parties are listening, but I think the Liberal Party has listened best of all.
Great. If I also focus on a great major issue is the gun violence and the availability of the guns. What do you say about it? How do you assure us that it's going to stop?
I can't assure anyone that gun violence will stop completely, and
when can we feel safe?
Yeah, well, what I can assure you is the federal government will do everything we can to reduce gun violence. It is a great challenge, and again, there's no single solution to this, but I was just saying on a personal note, when we think back to the Danforth shooting, Reese Fallon was actually a young Liberal volunteer in Beaches, East York with us. She had gone to Liberal policy conventions with us, and losing her and that horrible tragedy was, in 6 years I've had to give a lot of speeches, and the hardest speech I ever had to give was at Reese Fallon's funeral, and we continue to, as a Liberal Party, but especially as a Liberal association here in the East End, focus our efforts around what can we do to make sure something like that doesn't happen again. And so I've certainly called for a prohibition on the private possession of handguns, pushed for stronger support for community organizations that are involved in this space. And no party is getting this right, in my opinion, but we've come a long way, and that's why you see doctors that are involved in this space to address gun violence. They've supported Liberal efforts in the past, but basically what we see is there's a commitment to empower municipalities to ban handguns. I don't think it's enough, but it's a step forward. I don't think it'll be as effective as we want it to be, but a step forward, and it's certainly, I think, John Tory and City Council here in Toronto will take us up on that offer. We also see great action on assault rifles, and we see great action around storage rules, because we see the Danforth shooting, it was a gun that was stolen from a store in Saskatchewan, and it was a legal gun that became an illegal gun, and we need to really tamp down and have stronger storage rules, both for stores but also for those who own guns. It's frustrating though for me, because on handguns in particular, I want to see a prohibition that says already there's a rule, you can only use a handgun at the range. Well, we should have a rule that says you have to store it at the range, so we don't have then diversion into the illegal marketplace. We have made progress, so there are rules now in place about lifetime background checks, and we've proposed red flag laws. So there's a suite of policies that the Liberal Party is proposing. It's not quite as strong as I want it to be, if I'm speaking honestly, but we are moving a long way, and I would say there has been progress even in this platform. We had previously said we were going to have an assault rifle prohibition, but we were going to it was on a going forward basis, and we'd have a buyback, but it would be a voluntary buyback. Right. Well, now we're saying it's going to be a mandatory buyback. So if you have an assault rifle, you are either going to have to send it back to the government, and we'll purchase it at fair market value, or you have to disable it permanently. And so we are really going to make sure that these guns are out of circulation entirely. So there has been some work, and I guess the last thing I would say is there's been work on gun smuggling, so there's been $80 million delivered to the CBSA to improve efforts in this regard. And most importantly, we see a great connection between a lack of opportunity in some communities and the involvement in criminal activity. And so I do think there has to be a greater effort. If we think of a prevention rather than reaction, we focus our efforts on reducing poverty and supporting equality of opportunity across neighborhoods and across the country, no matter the background and no matter the individual. And I do think that will bear the greatest success, but it'll be in the longer term. In the short term, we need stronger gun control.
Yeah, and also I think the each generation should be involved more and more, and also seminars, symposium, and also I think media can play a great role.
Unquestionably.
Indigenous community are in mourn. They are sad, and the whole Canada is sad with the circumstances, what has happened with the residential school catastrophe. Why it came so late? I have a question. I always think, so today I would like to ask you why, because Liberal were here for 2 terms, and how come it was so ignored? I mean, nobody has noticed.
So The question of the graves of indigenous kids and the unmarked graves, that has been known. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified that before we even took office. We put money on the table, and it was more recent, I think it was Budget 2019, but to support indigenous-led efforts to uncover some of these sites. And we have also committed to a special representative to then work with indigenous communities to ensure justice and ensure justice for these unmarked graves. I would say though, the primary focus from 2015 has been clean water for First Nations communities. We saw there were 105 long-term advisories when we took office. We've lifted 109, and yet 50 or so remain. How could that be possible if there were 105 and we've lifted more? Well, it's because there were new long-term advisories that came online. And so what we've done is we have lifted 109 of the long-term advisories, lifted 188 actually of the short-term advisories so they don't become long-term advisories, and we've put money on the table so the water projects are underway in every community in need. We've also passed legislation with funding attached of $300 million to protect indigenous languages. We've closed gaps. It used to be that federal funding on reserve for education was less than provincial funding off reserve. That's obviously unacceptable. We closed the funding gap for education. We've passed legislation to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We passed legislation to reform child welfare for indigenous communities. There's a community in Saskatchewan that just entered recently into an agreement with the federal government and the provincial government. They take responsibility for child welfare. I just spoke recently with not only Indigenous advocate Cindy Blackstock, but also with the ministers responsible, and the ministers and the platform commits to this, but we're going to ensure fair compensation for First Nations kids who have been discriminated in the child welfare system, and we're going to make sure that there's funding in the child welfare system, including, I mentioned childcare, that we're going to create an early learning and childcare system for Indigenous communities as well. And so there's been so much progress, but it's challenging, of course. When you look at the history of Canada, most governments, and if you look at the history of Canada, contributed to negative outcomes. They supported the residential school system early on, of course, and so we have a legacy of injustice that we have to confront. It's not going to take one term, it's not going to take two terms. In fact, getting away from the Indian Act is going to take a much longer period of time, but we are committed to that work of self-determination. And so I guess I would say progress hasn't been perfect at times, but it has been incredibly significant. There's no government in my lifetime, certainly, that has taken these issues seriously, and we finally have a government that does. And so I hope we protect that progress, and then I hope the demand is not to sort of throw up our hands and say, we need a new government, there's been no action. Actually, there's been lots of action. I hope instead the demand is to say, when we find thousands of unmarked graves, we recognize the significant action that's come, but we demand more ambitious action. And I think the platform commits us to that more ambitious action, but I think everyone who cares about this issue needs to hold us accountable and say, we demand more ambitious action.
Okay, we are almost coming to the end. I would like to ask you about yesterday's debate, which happened in French, where the results, the survey said that Conservative is 35 and 30 Liberal. What do you say? If today would have been the election, the scenario would have been different. Do you think so?
I don't know. So in Beaches East York, we don't follow the polls too closely. We just keep our heads down and work hard.
You are belonging to that party.
Yes, but I mean, polls are sometimes a distraction in an election, so we're still 2.5 weeks out, and anyone who cares about this election, cares about ensuring we have a strong, progressive, and competent government, I think needs to keep their head down and just focus on knocking on doors and making phone calls and reaching voters and articulating not only the progress we've made, but how we want to build on that progress. And I worry sometimes that people throw up their hands and say, well, there's this problem and that problem. And yes, no government is perfect, but we really do need to hold on to that progress, because when I look at if you follow the polls and you do see the Conservatives that are currently leading, it's a great worry for me.
It was just one debate. More debates are ahead.
More debates are ahead, but look, one worry is that we're going to lose the progress if we have a Conservative government, whether it's on climate action or whether it is in relation to our immigration system and going back to some of the Harper-era reforms that were unfortunate and that we've reversed. When you look at indigenous issues. I mean, these aren't issues that have been taken seriously by conservative governments and aren't taken seriously in the platform. When you look at climate, a climate expert in UBC, a sustainable energy expert, he just said basically, he gave us a grade of 80%, he gave the Conservatives a grade of 50%, and he gave the NDP a grade of 20%. So I mean, we are the government that can deliver in a credible way on the issues that matter to Canadians. I think we just have to really hold up in a positive way that progress and then call attention to the fact we might lose that progress if the election continues as it's currently going. And so I hope post-Labor Day, more Canadians will be paying attention, and I have great confidence. I think I'm a pretty good campaigner, but Justin Trudeau is a very good campaigner, and I have every confidence we'll pull it out.
That's what I said, that he was talking very systematic yesterday. Everybody was appreciating. Now, I would like to give you the floor to say a few words to your audience directly.
Sure, well, I appreciate that. And I suppose I have said most of it, but I really am just asking you to send me back to work. I've worked really hard to be accessible. I really, over the last 6 years, it's been incredible getting to know so many different people, but you know, across Beaches East York, being a part of so many different communities, and in this particular community, I feel a great closeness, and I have so many friends, and I know that whether it is my work as the chair of the Cnada-Bangladesh Parliamentary Friendship Group, or my work as the chair of the All-Party Anti-Poverty Caucus, or my work leading efforts inside and outside of caucus to push our government, to support our government, to push our government to be more ambitious and to take on new ideas and to be more cooperative. And I hope you send me back to work, because I know I can make a positive difference. Politics remains to me one of the most important ways we can make a positive difference in other people's lives. I know the Prime Minister believes that. I certainly believe that. And I'm asking you to send me back to work and send our team back to work.
Thanks for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks so much.
আমরা কথা বলছিলাম বিচেস ইস্ট ইয়র্কের নেথানিয়াল রেক্সন স্মিথের সাথে। 2 বছর টার্ম শেষ করে আগামী আরেক টার্মের জন্যে তিনি নির্বাচিত হওয়ার ইচ্ছা প্রকাশ করেছেন। অনুষ্ঠানটি আশা করি আপনাদের ভালো লেগেছে। আগামী আরেক অনুষ্ঠানে দেখা হবে, আরও কারোর সাথে কথা বলবো আমরা এই নির্বাচন নিয়ে। ততক্ষণ পর্যন্ত ভালো থাকুন, স্বাস্থ্য সুরক্ষা বজায় রাখুন।